Greetings, everybody. Hello out there. Good evening. Welcome to the Westminster Town Hall Forum. I'm Tim Hart Anderson. I'm the senior minister here at Westminster and moderator of today's forum with Dr. Danielle Wood. We're pleased to have opening music for you today, and it's not just you here, but you who are with us via the live stream. Bluegrass band, the High 48s, formed in Northeast Minneapolis in 2006. They have one foot in bluegrass tradition and the other in the music of today. They take their name from the railroad slang for boxcars originally used to transport troops on the front lines in World War I. Those boxcars could carry 40 soldiers and 8 horses. The 48s, please join me in welcoming to the Westminster Town Hall Forum this wonderful bluegrass band.
Till the sun goes down. Draw my pay on Friday, but I'm broke by Monday morning. See my baby on a Saturday night while the moon is shining bright. Gonna live here until I die, just as sure as you're born. I was born in a sawmill town on the banks of the river. Daddy built his house down by the railroad line. And the winters are long and the cold nights make me shiver. And I wake up every morning to the sawmill whistle. I'm living in a sawmill town. I work until the sun goes down. Draw my pay on Friday, but I'm broke by Monday morning. Saturday night while the moon is shining bright. I'm gonna live here until I die, just as sure as you're born. For the sawmill stockyard, I throw my tools in the truck and I head on back to town. Every day is just the same and the work is so hard, but I know I'm gonna see my baby when the sun goes down. I'm living in a sawmill town. I work until the sun goes down. Draw my pay on a Friday, but I'm broke by Monday morning. See my baby on a Saturday night while the moon is shining bright. I'm gonna live here until I die, just as sure as you're born. Sun goes down. Draw my pay on a Friday, but I'm broke by Monday morning. See my baby on a Saturday night while the moon is shining bright. I'm gonna live here until I die, just as sure as you're born. I'm gonna live here until I die, just as sure as you're born. Thanks, folks. We're the High 48s from right here in the Twin Cities, and this is a real honor to be part of this great event. We're going to continue with the latest song that we put out to the world. It's an old folk song. Well, not an old folk song, but, you know, old to us. written by a wonderful songwriter named Dave Carter, who passed away some years ago. The story goes he wrote this after being picked up hitchhiking by none other than Merle Haggard. He had picked him up, and he was a student at a local music college, had a cello with him, and when Merle rolled the window down and asked him what was in the case, and he told him it was a cello, he said, "If I would have known that, I wouldn't have stopped and pulled you over or picked you up." But he ended up taking him to Tulsa, and this song came out of it. It's a great tune called Crocodile Man.
Mama raised me on riddles and trances, fatback, channel cat, lily white lies, all wrapped up in a gym crack fancy. Never knew Papa, never asked why. Whoa, people say Papa was a no account anyway. People say Papa was a rolling stone. I turned 20 on the Waccamaw Thruway, headed up river in the dark alone. I've been sleeping with a stranger in a no-name town, Thanksgiving dinner at the Top Hat Lounge, Christmas Eve at the Fantasy Tent. Lord have mercy on the Crocodile Man, Lord have mercy on the Crocodile Man. With a carny, a little out of Memphis, slaving in a sideshow, pennies in a jar. Beetle-eyed jokers, Hicktown princes, rhinestone rubies, rubber cigar. Wrestled me a gator up in Omaha City, done me another down in New Orleans. Tangled with a barker, ran up with a kitty, crawled the Mississippi and got away clean. I've been sleeping with a stranger in a no-name town, Thanksgiving dinner at the Top Hat Lounge, Christmas Eve at the Fantasy Tent. Lord have mercy on the Crocodile Man, Lord have mercy on the Crocodile Man. Underneath the levee in a cattail thicket, down in the shadow of a shady grove, there's a thatch roof rising from a poke fence picket, white smoke billows from a coal black stove. Inside the house is a hall of mirrors. Inside the mirror is the temple of sin. Inside the temple is the face of Mama. And Mama, she knows where I've been. I've been sleeping with a stranger in a no-name town, Thanksgiving dinner at the Top Hat Lounge, Christmas Eve at the Fantasy Tent. Lord have mercy on the Crocodile Man, Lord have mercy on the Crocodile Man.
We're going to try a new original for you. This is one that Eric wrote. During the pandemic, he was stuck at home and ended up watching a lot of Columbo reruns. So he put this instrumental together, and when he was looking for a name, he thought of his favorite Columbo villain. Who was that, the actress who played?
Ruth Gordon.
Ruth Gordon, playing Abigail Mitchell. Sarah Christopher.
Well, thank you very much. We're gonna try an old bluegrass number that comes by with the Bluegrass Cardinals. That was his quarantine project. This is one of my quarantine projects. Way easier. It has half the chords. Little tune called Morristown. Ready?
Yeah.
1, 2.
She got aboard that Greyhound, driver had diesel, said you go. She was crying when she let me like I was, but I couldn't let it show. Yeah, I wish could have told her music didn't mean that much to me. But music is my way of life, on the road is where I wanna be. She didn't like to travel or the nights I stayed out of town. She wanted me to stay with her, get a fancy job and settle down. But music's my profession, the only thing that I really know. If I'm ever gonna make it, I guess I'll have to make it all alone. Morristown, she's on the breakdown. It's going and she's coming back to you. Morristown, she's on the breakdown. It's going and there's nothing I can do. She said we had nothing left and I finally hold my way. There are people down in Nashville like the sounds making, so they say. And I couldn't leave the fellas who try so hard to get different sound. But she knows how much I love her. Happiness to her is Morristown. Morristown, she's on the breakdown. She's going and she's coming back to you. Morristown, she's on the breakdown. It's going and there's nothing I can do. Morristown, she's on the breakdown. It's going and she's coming back to you. Morristown, she's on the breakdown. It's going and there's nothing I can do. Yeah, she's going and there's nothing I can do.
Thank you. Well, from being, we're all from the upper Midwest, so we draw our influences from all kinds of different genres. And one of the things we love to do is take music that we've always enjoyed before we became bluegrass musicians and try to translate it somehow to these instruments. And one of our all-time favorite songwriters is the late, great John Prine. And Eric found this song. It's a kind of a deeper track. It's been a favorite of his for many years and decided to bring it to the band. And it even references his hometown. This is Sabu Visits the Twin Cities Alone.
The movie wasn't really doing so hot, said the new producer to the old big shot. It's dying on the edge of the great Midwest. Sabu must tour forever rest. Hey, look, Ma, here comes the elephant boy, bundled all up in his corduroy, headed down south toward Illinois from the jungles of East St. Paul. Manager sat in his office alone, staring at the numbers on the telephone, wondering how a man could send a child actor to visit in the land of the wind chill factor. Hey, look, Ma, here comes the elephant boy, bundled all up in his corduroy, headed down south toward Illinois from the jungles of East St. Paul. Sabu was sad, the whole tour stunk. The airlines lost the elephant's trunk. The roadies got the rabies and the scabies and the flu. They was low on morale, but they was high on. Hey, look, Ma, here comes the elephant boy, bundled all up in his corduroy, headed down south toward Illinois from the jungles of East St. Paul. Jungles of East St. Paul.
Here's another one that came out of the pandemic, out of some frustration. This one is called Just Walk Away. 1, 2, 3. Well, I heard that you've been seeing a guy who cuts you down and makes you cry. Just walk away with me. He's insecure, not kind at all. Worried his shoe size is too small. Well, just walk away with me. Just walk away so you can face a life of laughter and a love again someday. sad in a painful fight on the internet most every night. Just walk away with me. Well, it's hard to see you both lose playing a game with different rules. Well, just walk away with me. Just walk away so you can face each other at the dinner table next holiday. The bad boys bring the big wheels to town just to raise fists and blow smoke around. Just walk away with me. They're just begging you to validate all their fears and all their rage. Just walk away with me. Just walk away so you can face just why it is scared little boys turn out this way. Useless crap, a phone full of useless apps. Well, just walk away with me. It's hard to see us just going around and round and we don't know. Well, just walk away with me. Just walk away so we can face our brothers and our sisters and our neighbors today. Just walk away with me. Just walk away with me. Looks like we have time for one more song, but thank you so much. We're the High 48s, and really appreciate being invited to this wonderful event. It looks like a really interesting talk, and we're just happy to be a part of it. So we're going to close out with some traditional bluegrass here. No animals were harmed in the making of this traditional bluegrass song. It's a great old tune that is often sung in the duet style. So before bluegrass even, there was a tradition of going around the country like siblings. You probably heard of like the Stanley brothers and the Monroe brothers and the Delmore brothers, lots of brothers. And that tradition of singing, not just on choruses in harmony, but like throughout the whole song, is something that is very prevalent in bluegrass. We love to do it. I love to do it with Clint over here. So we're going to close out with one of my favorites. This one's called Rabbit and Law. Twisted in his hair, and that's the way I get him. I know, I know, I know, I know, I know. That's the way I get him. I know. Gonna get me a bride, I'm gonna twist it in his hair, and that's the way I get him. I know.
Another round of applause for the high 48s. Whoa! On a cold night in Minneapolis, they warmed the place up. Wonderful, thank you very much. Welcome. Welcome to the Westminster Town Hall Forum. My name is Tim Hart Anderson. I'm the senior minister here at Westminster, located on Nicollet Mall in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and I am the moderator of the forum. Today we're pleased to welcome Dr. Danielle Wood to the forum. For more than 40 years, the Westminster Town Hall Forum has invited speakers of conscience to address issues of the day from an ethical perspective. This is the second program in our season on climate change. This spring, 5 women on the forefront of climate science and solutions will speak at the forum. Today together they will show the ways climate change is already impacting our lives and discuss what we can do to change course. These programs will focus on solutions which we hope will inspire more Minnesotans not only to think about climate change, but to act. This season is presented in partnership with the McKnight Foundation, a family foundation based in Minnesota. McKnight advances a more just, creative, and abundant future where people and planet thrive. We invite you to visit our website to listen to our recent forum with Dr. Catherine Hayhoe of the Nature Conservancy on the case for climate hope. A list of upcoming forums is also on our website, westminsterforum.org. Forums are made possible because of individual supporters. Contributions from individuals like those of us in the room are the forum's largest source of funding. Your support in any amount powers these forums, and we invite you to consider supporting the Westminster Town Hall Forum. For those of you here in person, there are donation envelopes in your programs, and if you're watching via the live stream, please go to westminsterforum.org/donate. And by the way, it is good to have you with us via the live stream as well this night. Thanks to Minnesota Public Radio for recording and broadcasting all of our talks. NPR is presenting the entire spring climate series of the Town Hall Forum as a special week of programs. You'll be able to hear today's talk along with the rest of our spring season the week of April 25th, the last week of April. Our program will air each day that week at noon. And you can always watch or listen to our programs live on the Town Hall Forum website, as some of you are doing this night, or our Facebook page. And thanks, as always, to our media sponsors, MinnPost, a source for nonpartisan news coverage of Minnesota and beyond. Find more at minnpost.com. And Sahan Journal, covering issues affecting Minnesota immigrants and communities of color. Learn more at Sahan, S-A-H-N, sahanjournal.com. In the second half of today's program, Professor Wood will be taking questions live from those of you here in the audience. Those in the sanctuary will find a blank question card in your program. Have that ready to record a question for our speaker. And if you would note, if you're a student on the card, and I see we've got a lot of students in the audience here tonight. We're particularly interested in hearing from students. They always ask the best questions. At the end of the opening presentation, ushers will collect your questions, and then I'll present as many as possible to Dr. Wood as time permits. If you're watching online, please note your questions in the chat feature under the video at any point during the presentation, and we will try to collect and present those as well. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's Westminster Town Hall Forum speaker. Dr. Danielle Wood is the director of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Space-Enabled Research Group. She and her team take tools that typically orbit us and apply them to projects advancing social good on the Earth, including combating climate change. Professor Wood has held positions at NASA headquarters, the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, the Aerospace Corporation, Johns Hopkins University, and the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs. She has extensive experience in satellite design, earth science applications, systems engineering, and technology policy. In addition to directing the Space-Enabled Research Group, Dr. Wood serves as an assistant professor in the program in Media Arts and Sciences and holds a joint appointment at MIT's Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics. She also serves as MIT's faculty lead for African and African Diaspora Studies. Please help me welcome to Westminster Town Hall Forum, Dr. Danielle Wood.
They heard the south wind singing, a murmur of the rain, and they knew the earth was longing to see them all again. While the snowdrops still were sleeping beneath the silent sod, they felt new life pulsing within the dark, cold clod. Not a daffodil nor daisy had dared to raise its head. Not a fair-haired dandelion peeped, timid, from its bed. Though a tremor of the winter did shivering through them run, yet they lifted up their foreheads to greet the vernal sun. And the sunbeams gave them welcome, as did the morning air, and scattered o'er their simple robes rich tints of beauty rare. Soon a lovely host of flowers from vales and woodland burst, but in all that fair procession, the crocuses were first. First to weave for earth a chaplet to crown her dear old head, and to beauty the pathway where winter still did tread. And their loved and white-haired mother smiled sweetly 'neath the touch, where she knew her faithful children were loving her so much. That was The Crocuses by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was born a free woman who was Black in 1825, and published several volumes of poetry and novels. My name is Danielle Wood. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. And if you allow me, I'd love to invite you into my classroom. I teach for a living, and you've joined me tonight, so I hope you're open to learning a few thoughts that maybe are outside your daily activities. I want to tell you several stories tonight about space and Earth, to explore this theme around what it means for humans to grapple right now with climate change and the many relationships between humans and our natural environment. As you heard, one of my roles at MIT is serving as the faculty lead for African and African Diaspora Studies. I also teach several classes designed for students from any background: engineering and science, social science, the arts, humanities, architecture, business, medicine. Any interest is welcome. And I invite students to explore with me whether the mission statement of my team is really feasible. We say that we seek to advance justice in the complex systems on Earth using designs enabled by space. And in order for us to answer this question of can we actually do this mission, we start by exploring history. So I encourage my students to read the last 500 years of asking how our economy came to be the way it is today. And actually that question is very relevant to the question of how we arrived at this moment in history, a moment in which humans have created a lot of waste in the atmosphere in the form of greenhouse gases. I say waste only because it was unintended and that we were trying to produce energy or transportation or services or something that we manufactured, and in the meantime, a secondary result is that greenhouse gas is pumped into the atmosphere at alarming rates that leads to an overall change in the way our atmosphere reflects the energy back of the sun into space. And so this is what we mean when we say climate change in the formal sense, but there's a broader theme, right? The question of what it means for us to not manage our stuff carefully, whether it's the gas going into the atmosphere or plastics going into the ocean or any landfill that we're managing. How can we as humans eliminate waste, move into a world where we harness all the good matter in gas and solid and liquid form that we can use to take care of our planet rather than to make challenges for us? So in these classes, I encourage students to read about the time period when major ships started to travel regularly across oceans with large cargoes of people. Sometimes people were the cargo, right? The time period where we start to see major intercontinental transfer of slaves is also a period that allows colonization in a major way across oceans, where groups in one country feel that they have the right and even the opportunity, the privilege to travel to another area and say this land and its resources will be for us and for our people instead of for you. So colonization, slavery, and the ongoing form of impacts we see on that today are still part of the question we have to answer before we design the solution to today's challenges. With that in mind, I also want to start and use this beginning of my talk to read a land acknowledgement. I am borrowing from a local organization, the opera company nearby. I appreciated their wording on the land acknowledgement to consider that we are visitors on the land of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people. Though we have arrived here in a multiplicity of ways, we recognize our occupation on land that is of great historical, spiritual, and cultural significance to Dakota people. We also acknowledge the past and present harm to Dakota, Anishinaabe, and other indigenous nations through the systematic forced removal of communities and the unjust seizure of their lands. We urge you to join us in reflecting on our place in these histories and work toward rectifying the erasure of indigenous peoples. I live and work on the land of the Wampanoag people, and so I also want to acknowledge my role in sharing their land. One of the ways I try to go beyond just saying land acknowledgements is to spend time in dialogue. If you go to the website for my team, you'll find we had a really interesting series of discussions over the last year. During 2021, it was virtual, but we had the privilege to listen to leaders and scholars from indigenous or anti-colonial perspectives, highlighting their views on what we can think about for future activities for humans in space. And that, of course, links back to the question of how we live sustainably on Earth. I encourage you to explore that question. That's part of my ongoing land acknowledgement activity. Today, I want to tell you several stories about my own journey to explore this question of how space and Earth connect with this theme of climate change. I'll invite you to travel with me to several parts of the world, and our first stop is in the southern tip of Chile, as far south as you can go before your next stop is Antarctica. I was privileged to travel to Punta Arenas, a very small town with a small but important airport. And I was joining a team from NASA. During this time period, I had the privilege to work within NASA's headquarters in Washington, D.C., serving the team of the administrator and deputy administrator. This was Charlie Bolden and David Newman. And they were selected by President Obama to lead NASA in this time period. I was their assistant, but very pleased to be in that presence. And as part of this opportunity, I joined a mission where NASA's Ice Bridge program carries a plane. They asked permission from the Chilean government to fly it from Chile about 2 hours over the Southern Ocean to then spend the day for about 12 hours passing over parts of Antarctica. It's a special plane. It's been uniquely fitted with special kinds of lasers and radar systems that can help us measure what is happening to the ice below. Now, it was my first time to see Antarctica in person. I hope that many people have a chance to appreciate really the beauty and the uniqueness of the Antarctic landscape. In my naivete, I expected to see a place of just kind of white nothingness all day long. I thought I would just see the same view throughout the day, but I couldn't be more wrong. In fact, Antarctica is a place of great dynamism, of rocks and mountains and shadows and crevices and many colors. And so I was thrilled throughout the day simply to sit by the window and watch the amazing views pass by. But even more interesting, or additionally interesting, was a chance to climb into the bottom section of the plane and watch these lasers and radars in action as they are taking measurements. Now, the lasers are particularly useful for taking a measurement to see the height of the snow and the ice. And so with this plane, there's an ongoing process of taking measurements and watching how there might be a change in the height of the ice over time. The radars are very useful for actually bouncing signals down into the ice and the snow and getting reflection back. and they just call it sounding. It means you're able to understand what's happening at different levels, even inside the ice and snow. So very powerful instruments. This is part of a larger program called the ISAT missions. NASA had an ISAT-1, an ISAT-2, also with lasers and radars, and they're part of a long-term study of what's happening in the South Pole, as well as in the North, and to our Arctic and Antarctic regions. Now, the reason I tell you this story to start our discussion on climate change is that the poles are a great place to check if you'd like to find out what's happening to planet Earth. The health and well-being of these ice masses in Antarctica and in the Arctic in the North, they are signals to us of what's happening with our overall planet. Now, of course, they experience some seasonality, but over multiple seasons, you'd like to find out, are we losing large amounts of ice? And of course, sadly, we are. And the measures we can take in Antarctica and in the Northern Arctic, they give us an important measurement about what's going to happen to our planet and what is happening. And thinking about this, you can also note that we really have a global ocean system, which means that when we lose ice in large quantities at the poles, that is changing our overall ocean system. And you have the question of how that changes the life for people who live on coastlines all around the world. And in particular, those who live on coastlines in the areas around the equator often depend heavily on access to services, ecosystem services from their coast and from the ocean to have effective economies and safety. So when you have a change of coastal dynamics in places like Benin, where this dress is from, it changes many things about the life. So I've been privileged to be invited by many innovative leaders from places around the world, some in West Africa, where Benin is located, some in Southern Africa, for example, in Angola. I work with colleagues in Brazil, Indonesia, and also a native tribe here in the United States, the Yurok tribe. And these leaders are asking themselves, what will they do differently because of climate change? How will they continue to care and manage their lands and their people? And sustainability is really when we have a harmony between the humans, the plants, the animals, and the natural environment, a way that everyone can thrive. But often, due to our global economic system, we tend to see instead a striation where some people are kind of labeled as those who might deserve or naturally receive low-paying income jobs, for example. But also, there's not enough care for the natural environment. So that is not the path to sustainability, but there are leaders with clever ideas, especially at the local scale, to expand this. So I want to give you some examples of my journeys to experience the brilliance of some of these leaders. And we'll start in the example of Benin. Benin is a country in West Africa between Togo and Nigeria. It has a short coastline and a long northern ride up toward the Sahara Desert. In Benin, I have the privilege of working with a company called Greenkeeper Africa. This is a company that's focusing on ecotechnology, asking how they can use both traditional ways of working as well as modern technology to address local concerns. They were founded based on one particular concern due to a special plant. It's called the water hyacinth. Now, the water hyacinth is my favorite color. It's a purple plant. So it grows with a beautiful purple bloom and a lovely green flower. And if you saw it, you'd want to take it home and spread it in your ornamental garden and have it growing outside your window, which I think people tried to do. This is why it ended up in Benin and actually in many continents around the world. It's traditionally and originally from the South American continent. It really belongs in Amazonia. But it was popular, and as colonists spread around the world, they often carried it with them. Now, the water hyacinth grows very effectively, so much that it can tend to dominate when it's growing, especially on small lakes. It can really overtake the lake, and this can have profound impacts on bodies of water. I recently visited Benin and took a trip out to a very small lake, and this one is so small you can cross it in a boat, even a human-powered boat, in just maybe a few minutes. And on this lake, some time periods, it would be fully covered or mostly covered with this water hyacinth plant. But it's a place people usually fish. And when the plant is covering the water, it means that actually instead, the oxygen levels for the fish is changing. And the ability for fishers to use their nets is much more difficult. This community wanted to start a farming system. They showed me their fish farm, and they're interested in really having a regulated system where they understand how the health of the fish will be throughout their lifetime. But this plant becomes a concern. Now, you could ask, why don't they just get rid of it? This has been tried. There certainly is a desire, and many techniques have been used to consider how to reduce the plant's growth. Greenkeeper Africa, my host when I go to Benin, they have developed a clever process that can be ongoing and sustainable. Their approach is to pay local people who live in communities that are impacted by the plant to collect it manually. This creates a form of income, particularly for women in the area. They then buy the plant from the local communities, and they've turned it into a fiber through a special manufacturing process. The fiber can be used to absorb oil-based pollution. So it's an opportunity to create a product useful for the environment while also creating jobs. I was so impressed to hear about this business model. I first met this company about 5 years ago, and it was a pleasure just to hear their innovation. I gave a talk like this to them and explained how I work on satellite technology and the fact that we can use observations from space both to measure ice, but also to measure vegetation on land and on water. And actually, it was lovely that the team asked me to come visit and see what they're doing and ask the question, could we use satellite data to monitor their impact as they harvest this plant and try to support water resource management in lakes and rivers in this important town called Cotonou. So over the last few years, I've been able to visit at the invitation of these wonderful hosts and get to know people in the universities and the government agencies, and we've been trying to improve the methodologies to monitor this plant growing from space. I was so pleased to return to Cotonou after, of course, some difficulty with travel during the COVID pandemic. And recently, I spent a few days traveling on boats in the warm sun and enjoying being back and moving always with my camera, looking for examples of this plant so I can compare my camera pictures with the ones from space. And one question we've had over the time is, how has the change of the overall planet climate impacted the growth of the plant, and what other behaviors by humans are impacting it? So already we're seeing examples over the last 20 years of an increase in the plant growth. We'd like to further understand how it might be related to climate change, but also to local human activities. So in Benin, I have a chance to ask, how do we use data, in this case from NASA's Landsat satellite system, and from the European system called Sentinel? These give us data sets that are imagery-based, and that's very exciting. And many satellites that maybe you see as examples take pictures from space. But I also mentioned the examples of measuring ice. Those are taking measurements with lasers and with radars. You can measure things in the infrared and the microwave. There's so many ways to find out what's happening on Earth with these satellites. Another great invitation I received was from the Yurok tribe in Northern California. I was so pleased to be invited to visit their community, and they're interested in asking how they'll maintain their forest and a key river that's going through their ancestral lands. They want to continue to make sure that they're managing them well, and considering particularly the health of the local species that are really important to their culture, especially the deer and the salmon. Meanwhile, they're asking what climate change means to them and what it looks like to be able to interact with carbon markets, for example. Is there a way to benefit from the fact that people are concerned about climate change to help preserve their forest? So I'm really thankful for collaborating with them and for a project with one of my students who's going on a multi-year project to ask, how can we improve their use of satellite data? Similarly to how we track the plant, we can also use NASA imagery and European satellite imagery to understand how their plants are doing and to consider the impact of fires, which is really important for their region. Now, I think space can help us in several different ways thinking about what climate change means. The first example I gave you was observation. So technology from space helps us observe the climate change happening. Now, this can be discouraging to watch the sad news, but it's also a chance to see where there's been clever local approaches to managing this concern. The second category I mentioned is adaptation. Communities that know that they're facing climate change, and they have to ask the question, what can they do differently, given that it's already happening? Another team that I've been getting to know is based in Indonesia, and they have towns that have been there for generations, and they can see already that their coastlines are really changing, eroding, or they're facing land subsidence, and they know that it can't be fully reversed, but they have to ask, what can they do by planting trees, especially mangrove trees? What can they do by thinking about the local zoning procedures, and by considering ways to address tsunamis when they occur? All these are ways to adapt to what's ongoing in climate change. There's also the question of how space can be a form of imagination. How can it help us think differently about how to address the important challenges we're facing and innovate differently in a way that brings new ideas and opportunities? For this, I'll ask you to join me on another story and travel with me to Central Florida, where I grew up. I'm very fortunate to have grown up near the home of Zora Neale Hurston, a storyteller who traveled through the southern eastern part of the United States and the Caribbean and collected stories. And we've had for many years in the town of Eatonville, an annual festival celebrating Zora Neale Hurston's life. Zora was somebody who believed in the power of knowledge and history being passed down orally. She was trained as an anthropologist, but in many ways broke some of the traditional rules of anthropology by focusing on celebrating, just listening to the local people, whether in Florida, South Carolina, or Georgia, or Louisiana. And she found ways to preserve their stories through her writing and through her plays. And just like Zora, I spend my time also traveling. I've been very privileged to learn about the space goals of a variety of countries around the world. I call myself sometimes a space tourist, by which I mean I often tour countries around the world and find out what they want to do in space and why they do it. I've been privileged to meet the people who founded many space programs in places like Nigeria and Ghana, South Africa and Kenya, the United Arab Emirates, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore. You can go also to Latin America and consider places like Brazil and Argentina and Chile, where they all have aspirations to use space technology for their national development. And why is that, you might ask? Well, it traces back to the same conversation we're having about climate and the broader need to manage our environment. Every country realizes that they can take a special benefit from having satellite-based observation of their country to better manage the environment and to think about broader needs in the country. Satellites also provide several other benefits, including the ability to make sure we can position our transportation systems effectively, especially planes, but also other forms of transport. They also bring us, of course, communication services that are part of our global network. So in all these areas, governments understand they have a role to play, and many of them want to increase the number of people in their country who have the ability to understand how to design or operate or manage satellite systems as part of their national services to ensure they're addressing climate change effectively. So I've been privileged to watch the leaders who are often answering the people in their own country to explain why space is so important to their national needs. They often have to explain why it's important to observe how forests change over time, or how sometimes there can be dangerous plumes of algae in coastlines that cause concern for fishers or for people swimming. They have to ask the question of how do we consider soil moisture? How do we use satellites to measure soil moisture to give us concern of famine or drought? So all over the world, governments in Africa, Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, they're asking how to increase local activities in space, and I've been privileged to visit many of their communities and find out with them. Another example is from Angola, where I've been privileged to visit the National Space Program, and they invited me to learn about their concerns of drought in the southern part of the country. In this case, we started off the trip in Luanda. And Luanda is a thriving capital city, very busy, lots of construction. People tend to wear modern clothing that looks like what I might wear myself in a Western style. And so I spent the day there and met with people in government agencies, met those from the National Management Office of the Space Program, as well as the communications, transportations, and other ministries. We then took a flight a few hours south to an area that's had drought for the last few years, cycles of drought, and then cycles of extreme rain that cause flooding due to the dryness of the land. And so I was really struck by seeing this different part of the country and the challenges they face, because people tend to raise cattle and depend heavily on the health of the cattle for their well-being. And they have a goal to increase their use of satellite data to make measurements like understanding soil moisture or areas where you get short-term pools of water to find out how they can use that in planning, how to manage this river that is often facing long-term dryness. And all of this comes together to ask, what role can be played once we have better information? What kind of cooperation can happen across government and universities and nonprofits to ensure that the need is brought and needs are addressed where they're most felt? Now let's go back to that story I mentioned that's happening in Florida. I was fortunate as a college student to serve as an intern within NASA. And in particular, they have an office that asks the question, how can we take technologies invented by NASA and spin them out into society? I was fortunate to spend multiple months learning about examples of technologies that were first invented by NASA and then were used in other parts of society. One of my favorites is the example of a water filtration system originally designed to help astronauts, because if you're on a space station, then you have to keep everything and use as much as you can over and over again, especially water and air. So really there's a lot of creativity happening in our design for living in a spaceship. Part of it is that we try to recycle useful material like water and air. And some of the water that you need is in the urine that is coming from yesterday's water. And so NASA has developed systems to be able to clean wastewater, including urine and other forms of waste, in order to take possible benefit, all the benefits possible from whatever liquid is available. So that kind of technology is, of course, very applicable to other settings. If you have a source of water that's not guaranteed to be clean, you can use the same kind of technology from this filtration system, and it's been transferred already through a nonprofit and used on Earth for areas that need to do water filtration. So we could ask the question, what kind of imagination do we form when humans face the challenges of space? Now, once you leave this pleasant Earth environment, some particular challenges will face you as you are journeying into space. As you exit the atmosphere, you'll start to experience the vacuum environment, which of course you need to be pressurized into a safe cabin to be safe within that. There are major temperature extremes if you're orbiting the Earth, because on one side you have the sun facing you, but as you go away on the back side of the Earth, you're in a place where the sun's not keeping you safe anymore. As you move even farther away from Earth, if you go beyond the magnetic field of the Earth, you'll be in a place where you're exposed to all kinds of radiation coming from our sun, but also from other sources across the solar system and beyond. So there's many things that can hurt you in space, and because of this, we're very careful when designing both human space missions, but also robotic missions. And all the innovation that goes into that design can be transferred, and is often transferred, into other tools. We can think about a few fun ideas for how to take the challenges of space and bring it back home. You heard one example of recycling air and water. We can also think about the way that we've traveled to space over the years. The space shuttle was a certain kind of rocket, but it used as ingredients for its fuel simply the ingredients for water, hydrogen, oxygen. When they were combined, the result coming out of the space shuttle engine was really steam. So this idea of using fuel cells and propulsion that can be clean can certainly be further innovation for our ideas. My own particular team at MIT, we're exploring another form of propulsion that we hope will be inspiring, because it turns out that you can use beeswax as a fuel. It's been shown theoretically, and we'd like to show it can be done in space. And we really appreciate a donation of beeswax from local beekeepers in Boston and from beekeepers in the government of Bermuda that share with us some of their examples so we can compare the different geographies. And we're doing research these days on planes and on rockets, and hopefully soon on the International Space Station. We're trying to show we can manufacture unformed beeswax into a special shape that's just the right one for burning as a fuel. And if we're successful, we hope that in the future we could have robotic systems actually manufacturing beeswax into fuel in space, and that would demonstrate that we can use a natural ingredient that can be formed all over the world in many countries that could actually be useful for an energy system in space, but perhaps beyond. So we hope that as you think about the challenges of climate change and you ask, what role does space play? You'll be inspired to say, how can some of our most challenging questions give us inspiration? One thing I work on regularly is the concern about space debris. You may have heard of this concern. We are putting a lot of satellites in space, and in this case, I mean particularly US companies, and it's useful, it brings us important tools, but the other question has to be, how will we manage the use of these satellites so we can make sure that they're going to be safe and not hitting each other or hitting other pieces of trash? It's a really hard problem, but it's hard in a similar way to climate change. In both cases, you have this long-term concern about spreading waste and not managing our stuff carefully enough. So we can ask the question, how will working on addressing space debris feed back into our collaboration and our efforts to address climate change in the long term? I'm working on both problems, but there's a lot to be done, and it's something that really requires a knowledge exchange across the two communities. So I'm hoping that as we continue to think about how nations can coordinate and consider exchange across countries and across organizations, that same kind of thinking will feed back into our work for issues like climate. I'm nearing the end of my prepared remarks, but I want to just highlight another example of a poem by Frances Harper. Let me make songs for the people, songs for the old and young, songs to stir like a battle cry whenever they are sung. Not for the clashing of sabers, nor carnage, nor for strife, but songs to thrill the hearts of men with more abundant life. This city is one of great richness and sometimes a city of grief. But I think these words from Ellen are powerful for us. We all have a role to play to create the song that will bring abundant life in our communities. So let's each take our part, and as we think about big problems like climate change and close-by challenges, like our own neighborhoods need to be safe places for everyone, I think we can work together to write those songs. So thank you so much for being here. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wood. We're grateful for your insight and comments and your provocative presentation here at the Westminster Town Hall Forum. We're coming to you from downtown Westminster Presbyterian Church on Nicollet Mall in downtown Minneapolis. My name is Tim Hart Anderson. I'm the senior minister at Westminster and moderator of the forum. Our speaker today is Professor Danielle Wood, director of the Space Enabled Research Group at MIT. If you're here in the sanctuary, we invite you to write a question on the card that you were given when you came in. Hold it up for our ushers to collect. If you're watching online, please put any questions or comments into the chat feature, and we will try to retrieve those and present them as well. While the ushers now are collecting questions, I'd like to thank our co-sponsor, the McKnight Foundation, for this spring series on forums that are facing climate change. Thanks as well to our broadcast partner, Minnesota Public Radio. NPR will broadcast this spring's forums the week of April 25th, the last week in April. One forum will air each day at noon, including a live broadcast of our April 27th forum right here in the sanctuary. And thanks as well to our other media partners, MinnPost and Sahan Journal. Learn more about them at minnpost.com and sahanjournal.com. And now, Professor Wood. If you're ready, I will present the questions from the audience. You mentioned the idea of frontiers, and the frontier of space is often viewed as, or talked about as, the final frontier. Frontiers bring to mind colonialism and imposition of one people's values and resources on another. And what can you tell us about the view of space as a frontier, especially in light of some of the commercial efforts to get into space these days from billionaires around the country?
Really thankful for this question. I do spend a lot of time with my students and my colleagues asking, what do the words mean that we use to talk about space, and why should we be careful to use words that really express our real thoughts? So certainly there's an important reason to keep reviewing the history of the United States and ask, what have we done in the past that we can learn from? And one thing that was part of the US history was this idea of settler colonization, in which it wasn't just a question of sharing land with someone else, but saying those who were here originally should be pushed and pushed and pushed until they were no longer around. Well, one might appear, but actually instead they survived, and instead there are many folks from traditional communities that are still in the communities, but many have been pushed to new lands. So I would hope that the part of the concept of thinking of the future of humans in space could look different. Now, people will sometimes ask me, well, how can it be the same when there aren't people living on places like the moon? They'll say, surely it's not a fair comparison because a place like the moon doesn't have any residents right now. I think there's two important questions to ask. One is, what is the mode of thinking when a group is accessing a new place? And the other is, what does international law say about the topic? Let's start with the law. We have the benefit that actually early in the space program, I'm very proud of some of the early people that came together, even though it was the Cold War, and several treaties were written that set a foundation for international cooperation in space. One is called the Outer Space Treaty, and this one provides a few key principles that actually many countries have signed and turned into their own national law, including the US. So in this case, these treaties highlight that actually no country can take sovereign territory outside the Earth, meaning places like the moon or asteroids. The space is actually belonging to all humankind, and that states should then regulate the activities of their own organizations and the companies inside them to ensure that they follow this principle. Meanwhile, there's a little bit of ambiguity because the treaties also say that if you're a group that's able to harvest something or remove a rock, for example, from a location in space, you could use it, maybe even sell it. Well, what happens is that different countries have interpreted. Some say yes, some say no. So what we have is a case where it seems like people will have the opportunity legally in their own countries to do this sort of thing. So I could ask the question, when people go to space, what will be their reason? Are they going to try to harvest some valuable material? There likely are a number of materials that you could sell on Earth and make a lot of money. Will they be going to celebrate the culture of humans from all over the world and to share a sense of connectedness with other humans? Will they be going to celebrate cultures that revere parts of locations in space as sacred? There are a number of communities, indigenous communities around the world, that view places like the moon as part of their own sacred landscapes. And so we have a chance to learn about their values. I think all of these come together to ask how we can practice being anti-colonial and thinking about space. I would like to offer the idea that space is a public shared resource, not just a resource, but a place that has shared benefits and connectedness. So whatever we do, I would hope, leads to benefit for a large swath of humanity, hopefully everyone, rather than for a small group at a time.
Interested, I think, to know that there are Russian and U.S. astronauts now on the space station working together, an instance where the Outer Space Treaty is actually being implemented. There are several questions coming about technologies around sunlight that are harnessed by instruments we put up into space for creating energy perhaps in space, or maybe diverting some sunlight somehow to influence global warming here. Can you comment about technologies related to sun in space?
Actually, I'm so glad for the question. I'd hope to talk about sunlight tonight. I think the sun is such an important story to consider. We could go on for hours about the sun. We could ask, what are all the ways the sun influences us directly? How does it send us unique gifts like the aurora borealis in the north? And we could ask the question, are we even benefiting as much as we could be from the sun? It's a beautiful thought that solar panels can be used in our houses to give us energy in our own homes, and they're also one of the primary sources of power for satellites orbiting the Earth. And because of this ongoing need to innovate in both the Earth-based and the space-based side, there's been a really healthy exchange of technology between the space solar power industry and the Earth solar power industry. Now, some people have proposed the idea of collecting a lot more energy from the sun in space by putting very large solar collectors in space. There's a concept called space-based solar power. And I've studied it a bit, and I've read some of the historical examples. In the 70s, there's a really in-depth government study that explored all the engineering that would have to happen to make it possible. They concluded back then that it was very difficult given the current technology. So a team like, including myself and a few others, have checked every few decades to say, okay, what are some of the updates that have happened that make it more possible than the past? I think there's a few things we still don't quite understand. For example, it's pretty feasible to collect a lot of sun energy in space, and transferring it down to Earth has more questions to answer. There's ideas to do it by lasers or microwave energy, and the question will be, what impact would it have on our atmosphere, on the health of animals and plants? These are things that are not fully understood. There's also a question, though, as people are going to have more activities happening actually in space in the next few decades. And I think we can certainly ask, can we collect energy in space to be used in space? There may be future small space stations, or manufacturing facilities, or what you might call a gas station, a fuel depot. They will need energy too. I think we'll certainly see more uses of solar energy. And there's a question of, can we even use it as part of systems to travel? There are systems that use electricity based on energy absorbed by the sun, and they use that to power what's called electric propulsion systems, and they travel slowly but surely across the solar system. So we'll see, I think, more and more of this, and we want to keep thinking about how to improve that for life on Earth as well.
Someone is asking a question about the rising sea levels, and if satellite technology can be used, or is being used now perhaps, to identify suitable lands where populations might be relocated away from the coast so as to minimize the impact on population of a rising sea level and also minimize impact to the land.
What a great question about rising sea levels. This is certainly one of the key indicators we like to watch, thinking about the global impact of climate change. And we could ask the question, can we use satellites to observe this change? That's one question. There are special kinds of satellites that are designed to help us measure the change in sea level rise around the world. And there's a whole series of cooperation between the US and some European countries that have done a series of missions over multiple decades to watch the sea level rise change. So that's one piece. And of course, there's a question of what's happening on the coastal cities, and to consider where their coastlines have changed. You can use a technique either with 2 imagery satellites or sometimes with lasers or radar systems. There's also the goal to measure how the height or the shape of the land has changed. So one satellite type is measuring the oceans change, one's measuring the land change. And with that, you can ask the question, where do we see increased likelihood of flooding? Now, there are some countries around the world that have asked, do they need to actually relocate major cities or capitals because there's been a concern about climate change and sea level rise? I've met people also from small island nations that literally can watch over one generation how the infrastructure, the roads, and the island itself are really changing shape drastically. Certainly, we could ask the question, who may have to relocate? But what's concerning to me also is that often those who may need to relocate are those that were already more economically vulnerable and those who had fewer options and how they generate income. Many communities that live on coastal regions depend on activities like fishing or farming that really is done in that one location. And if you ask them to move, traditions that are long generation held may be difficult to change. So I think we could really ask the question, can there be ways to help communities adapt where they are if they prefer to, but also how do communities talk about these issues? But even to bring it right here to an area that's maybe in a different part of the world, even for areas that are urban and that are facing questions of climate change, it's a different category of concern. But of course, extreme heat is another form of concern that affects those in urban areas, and urban areas often experience increased heat as opposed to areas with more trees and rural areas. So we can also bring the climate change question to this region and ask, we can use satellites as well to track areas of higher heat due to urban effects.
You've spoken quite a bit about the technology used in space, about research that you've conducted and others in the scientific community. How do you move from research and technology to policy and change? Specifically, what policy initiatives or actions do you believe the U.S. government, federal government, should take to best make progress on ameliorating global climate change, knowing what you know from your research?
It's an excellent question. I have to pause and just give a lot of appreciation since I'm funded by a number of government grants and I'm a former government employee, so I don't speak fully, I guess, with an unbiased answer. What I want to share, in a sense, is all the good things that actually are happening. Part of what I think we need in leadership is, one, to repeat important messages over and over again, and also to celebrate good things that are done so they can be amplified and increased. So I was fortunate to work previously for NASA and had a chance also to be part of their Earth science community. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but NASA's budget tends to be about between $20 and $22 billion given different budgets and different reviews by Congress. And out of those billions of dollars, a lot of it is used for science. And this is a great question, right? You're saying, how does it go from science to helping? But using that funding for science leads to some focus on the distant universe, on the sun, other planets, but a big chunk of that is focusing on Earth. And what's so great is that actually the funding we use for studying space and Earth, a big chunk is really for our own planet. It's really the planet we study the most. So I am very proud of the good work done by NASA employees and universities, teams that are funded by NASA, who are studying climate change, but also many aspects of Earth. And NASA has a program called Applied Sciences. Full disclosure, I'm also on the advisory council that the government forms for this, so I'm definitely speaking as an insider in that sense. But I'm so proud of the applied sciences community. All of us ask how we can ensure that satellite data collected by many satellites owned by the US, but also international partners and companies, we want to combine it in a way that helps bring benefit. So one thing I would say is, on the policy side, I hope we keep doing this. I hope we continue to invest in research, but also applications, so that the data can be used in areas like food security and water resource management, as well as areas including disaster response and air quality and health. So step one is keep what we're doing and maybe even increase these kinds of funds for research. Another big direction, though, is to ask how we're ensuring that students at the university and high school level have a chance to get educated early on. And there are programs, some I'm a part of, that try to encourage students. One program that I help to lead is called Zero Robotics. And this program teaches middle school and high school students to code, but we teach them to code robots that are already in space. So it's a chance for them to experience how things move differently when they're orbiting the Earth in free fall. And it means we hope we're inspiring them. So I think another policy recommendation that would not be surprising is that I think we should keep funding programs that help young people, young students, get excited about these kinds of questions and see themselves as a part of the team addressing these concerns. I was a student with a lot of good grades in high school, but I wasn't sure what direction I would go in. And it made a big difference when a teacher asked me to apply for a program at NASA when I was 17. If I hadn't had that teacher suggest this idea, I probably would not be here today, because I wasn't thinking about a space career until someone suggested that I consider it. So you too can find a student and tell them, hey, there's opportunities for you to learn 3D printing or space technology or coding, and that could help you in your career.
What disparities are there? You just described an experience of a wealthy country in terms of space technology. Disparities between wealthy countries and countries that lack resources for these kinds of technologies. What disparities are there, and how can we be more equitable in distributing these technologies?
This is a great question, and a big part of why I'm wearing this dress and celebrating the fact that I've traveled to many countries, particularly in Africa. Now, there's a myth that says some countries can't afford to have a space program. But I'm here to tell you it's not true. Every country can, partly because every country has some tax income, and if you're a government, that means you have some budget to work with. And budgets like that can be spent on infrastructure, roads and bridges and hospitals and schools and satellites. Now, part of the reason I say that so confidently is that there's been great innovation in the last decade or so, maybe 2 decades, particularly in what we call small satellites. Now, small partly is talking about the size. Let's look at the size of this podium. If you had a satellite this size, it might be about 200 or 300 kilograms, and that would be a good size for launching with several other satellites on a big rocket. There's also a philosophy. Small satellite engineering means building a satellite that won't last forever, maybe 5 years. It'll then be destroyed by all those powerful things I mentioned that are in space that want to kill you if you're there, like the vacuum and the temperatures and the radiation. But that's okay. We'll make it a little cheaper and plan to replace it, and also planned to make sure it comes back and safely enters the atmosphere and is burned up in a way that disposes of it, so it's not left as space junk. Now, I would submit that every country that exists as a sovereign country, a member of the UN, can afford to buy their own small satellite, and many have. So these days, countries around the world have small satellite programs, small being that style of engineering. So I've been a part of teams that have learned about these programs, particularly in countries in Africa. You could mention, for example, Kenya and Mauritius and Ghana. I know the teams that built their first smaller satellites, and they were interested in the training benefits, but also having their own data about their environment. So actually, there are disparities, but any government that can have a government, which also pays employees and builds bridges, they can have a space program, and they do.
Let's talk about beeswax for a moment. Someone asks how much beeswax is needed to be equivalent to 1 gallon of gasoline.
That's a wonderful question. I'll get my grad students right on it. I won't answer that right now. But what's exciting is that for now, we're thinking about a very small amount of beeswax for our mission. I mentioned these smaller satellites. Many of them, when they're launched in space, they're also cheaper because they aren't carrying any fuel on them, and they plan for a shorter mission. So you put them in space on a rocket, and they orbit the Earth for a while. And if you go not too high, which in engineering speak is, say, 400 to 600 kilometers, they naturally will be slowed down by tiny particles of gas at the top of the atmosphere, which is useful. And then they will be slowed by the drag and enter the atmosphere and burn up safely. Well, I say safely because so far there's only been a few of them. If we get a lot of them, we'll have to see how safe that is. Our idea is to make a box that has a small motor in it with some beeswax, and you also need some kind of oxidizer, oxygen, for example. And we want to make that cause this smaller satellite to come back into the atmosphere even faster, say months faster than otherwise. That's our idea for now. We'll keep testing it. It's all being invented and experimented on. But certainly we could ask the question, one of the ways we explore this idea of comparing different kinds of fuels is through a concept called impulse. And in particular, you can sort of compare the performance of different fuels. So we'll just say that the beeswax has a similar impulse, that we use that phrase in engineering, to other fuels, but it's particularly good for certain sizes and shapes. It's not very good for making a small change in your direction, but it's good for giving you a good kick back toward the Earth if that's where you're headed.
We have time just for one more short answer. Many people are feeling a sense of panic about climate change, certainly urgency, and we're hearing that from all kinds of international agencies that the time is up, time is now. As a scientist engaged in working on climate change using technologies in space, How do you deal with that, with the sense of urgency and perhaps panic?
I'm so glad we could end the night thinking about emotions. I think it's very appropriate as humans to notice our emotions. We could ask the question, who is being physically hurt, emotionally hurt, financially hurt right now due to climate change in your own neighborhoods, in the world more broadly? I think we can let these emotions keep us motivated. Without getting too bogged down with fear, we can ask the question, why should we continue to repeat and repeat the urgent need to take action on climate change? Sometimes we hear it from the next generation. They're telling us, hey, we are going to grow up in this planet, help us make it safe. I think we can find the balance between sometimes mourning, sometimes listening to a blues song to help you kind of get those emotions out, and then coming back and looking for ways to take action. And hopefully that ongoing cycle of actually acknowledging that, yes, it is concerning that people around the world who already may have difficult lives to live are going to have increased challenges due to climate change. Whereas others actually will benefit. So we want to think about how that balance can be different. Let's use the emotions to help us be concerned, sometimes angry, and then channel that into a sense of action and hopefully cooperation with people who are different from us. Let's find ways to use that to design creatively. We could think about the brilliance of people who have come through past experiences. I mentioned Zona Hurston, for example. People like her who have overcome by using their education and their ideas to share something for the next generation. Let's do the same as we think about climate change.
May it be so. Thank you, Dr. Danielle Wood, for being here at the Town Hall Forum. Thank you very much. I think we'll probably stop recording here. I did have one question that I was particularly interested in. The Space Force. I mean, is that something that's we really do need in terms of the outer space treaty? And do you have any comments about that, just sort of off the air for those of us here, a little bonus conversation?
Sure, I'm happy to share. You know, one of the things that can be confusing is you'll hear a news story about space, and it sounds like something that totally came out of nowhere. Like suddenly a strange thing is happening. And so unless you've been following the little bits of news about space, these things can seem just very confusing. So let's go back in history a little bit. When space was first becoming an activity where countries could send objects to space, we had direct interaction in the US, for example, of NASA as a civilian agency, but also of the military. And throughout the time that the US has been active in space, there's always been a strong role for the military. It's worth disclosing, just for candor, that my PhD work was funded through a fellowship that I applied for with the Department of Defense in the US because they had a bigger budget for fellowships than other groups did. I also got funding from NASA and from the National Science Foundation. But they were interested in funding research. And actually in the United States, the military budget for space has always been bigger than actually NASA's budget. NASA has a great budget, but military has a bigger one. I had a chance to work for some agencies that are involved with government space programs after my PhD. I learned a lot. And I would say I felt I was doing useful work that could help people. And overall, I would say that it's not new for the military to be very involved with space. In this case, the Air Force has been the body within our military that's been working on space, operating satellites for weather. They also monitor, looking for nuclear launches, possible launches with nuclear warheads. They also take a role to consider what's happening, of course, for the actions by our military operators. So that's been true the whole time. And then, you know, there's a question of, just like at some point the Army basically had some people with planes, and they were labeled the Air Force for the Army. At some point, the Air Force got its own title. And so there was a proposal at this time that maybe space is an activity big enough for its own force. Now you could debate this, whether or not you need a different title, but I would say the activities of the Space Force aren't particularly new. They have a new name and new uniforms, but they're doing things that have been done for many years. So in fact, right now, and in the past, the Air Force and now the Space Force, they've been monitoring all the objects orbiting the Earth for safety. They also operate our global positioning system that we all use, and our phones are getting a free signal all around the world from the GPS system, which was designed originally for actually guiding missiles as a way to navigate them to the target. It was designed for that, paid for by the military, but then turned into a signal we could all use. So it's interesting that we've had this role of the military in a very active way, but people didn't have that label or that title. So I'd say, I don't think the Space Force is new. I think it's just a reshift in how you label. But it is important to ask if people experience a different sort of attitude, right, about what's happening in space. Our treaties also say that space is a place for peaceful uses. So let's keep that going as well.
No. Well, a little bonus question for us who stayed out on a Friday night.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Really appreciate it.
Unless you walked here, you probably parked downstairs. And if you did park here, you want to get your car and head out in your car rather than walking down the wall for a drink or something to eat and leaving your car here, because it'll be here all night. And we'll be glad to let it out maybe Monday or Sunday if you come to church. But so want to take your car with you tonight. Thank you for being here. We'll see you again at the next forum.
Thank you very much.
Good. Sorry to throw a little Space Force thing at you.
It's a question I'm ready for anytime.
I expect you here.